A man stops in the middle of a raging storm to save what he thinks is a helpless puppy shivering and covered in mud, but when he finally gets it home and cleans it off, he discovers something that turns his world upside down. This isn't a puppy at all. What did he rescue, and why was it abandoned on that lonely road? This heartwarming and life-changing story of trust, redemption, and second chances will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about the bond between humans in the wild. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from. Today, the rain drummed against Tom Randall's old Ford pickup as he navigated the dark country road. His windshield wipers worked overtime, sweeping sheets of water aside in a steady rhythm that matched his heartbeat. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the surrounding pine trees. In brief, harsh flashes, Tom's weathered hands gripped the steering wheel tighter. The days counseling sessions at the shelter weighed heavily on his mind. A young veteran had broken down, sharing stories that hit too close to home. The familiar ache of guilt crept into Tom's chest as faces from his chaplain days flooded his thoughts. Soldiers he'd prayed with, comforted, and ultimately lost. "Lord, give me strength," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the storm. He blinked hard, trying to focus on the rain-slicked asphalt ahead. The memories pressed in like the darkness around his headlights. The explosion that took Johnson, the ambush that claimed Martinez, the letters he'd written to their families. A flash of movement caught his eye, yanking him back to the present. Something small darted across his headlights, then huddled in the muddy runoff of along the shoulder. Tom squinted through the glass, his foot easing off the accelerator. The wipers swept across, clearing his view. For a moment, there, trembling in the beam of his headlights, was a small shape pressed against the ground. A dog, maybe. The creature shivered violently, clearly struggling in the rushing water of the drainage ditch. Tom's hands tightened on the wheel as he carefully steered onto the shoulder, gravel crunching beneath his tires. The rain intensified, pounding against the roof of his truck like bullets. He couldn't just drive past. Not when something needed help. Reaching behind his seat, Tom grabbed the old army blanket he kept for emergencies. He took a deep breath, steeling himself against the storm. The rain was coming down in sheets now, but the desperate shape in his headlights hadn't moved. Tom pushed his door open, and the wind nearly yanked it from his grip. Cold rain instantly soaked through his jacket. As he stepped out into the storm, he clutched the blanket to his chest, protecting it from the worst of the downpour. As he carefully made his way toward the frightened creature, Tom crouched low beside the muddy ditch, his knees sinking into the soft earth. Rain cascaded down his face and neck, soaking through his jacket and shirt until they clung to his skin. In the harsh beam of his headlights, he could finally see the creature clearly, a small, pathetic bundle of wet fur, shivering violently in the rising water. Two frightened eyes met his, reflecting the light like tiny amber beacons. The animal's chest heaved with rapid, shallow breaths, its whole body trembling from cold and fear. Tom's heart ached at the sight. "Easy there, little one," he murmured slowly, extending the blanket. With gentle movements, he wrapped the sodden creature in the thick fabric, carefully tucking the edges around its quivering form. The animal didn't resist or try to bite. It simply lay there as if too exhausted and scared to fight. "You're safe now," Tom said softly, his words nearly lost in the howling wind. "I've got you." The bundle felt surprisingly light in his arms as he cradled it against his chest, shielding it from the worst of the rain. Making his way back to the truck, Tom's boots slipped in the mud, but he held steady, protecting his precious cargo. He opened the passenger door one-handed and placed the wrapped animal on the seat with utmost care. Quickly climbing into the driver's side, he cranked the heater to full blast, aiming the vents toward his shivering passenger. As Tom steered back onto the road, he kept glancing at the bundle beside him, his jaw tightened with anger at the thought of someone abandoning what he assumed was a puppy in such terrible weather. The blanket rose and fell with quick, shallow breaths, but the animal remained still. Otherwise, who would do such a thing? He wondered aloud, his voice gentle despite his anger. The wind howled outside as his wipers continued their steady rhythm. Every few moments he checked on his passenger, making sure the blanket stayed secure. The familiar sight of his cottage finally came into view, its porch light a beacon in the darkness. Tom pulled into his gravel driveway, the truck's headlights illuminating the rain-slick path to his front door. He gathered the bundled creature in his arms, once more feeling. Its trembling had lessened somewhat in the truck's warmth. "Let's get you cleaned up," he murmured, holding the precious bundle close as he made his way to his cozy cottage. Inside his cottage, Tom gently placed the trembling bundle on his bathroom counter. The small creature lay motionless except for the rapid rise and fall of its chest under the bright bathroom light. He could see just how dire the situation was. Clumps of mud matted the animal's fur mixed with twigs and leaves. Its eyes were barely open, just thin slits of amber showing through. "You're in quite a state," Tom said softly, reaching for a clean washcloth. He adjusted the tap until the water ran lukewarm, then wet the cloth. With careful movements, he began cleaning the mud from the tiny creature's face. The animal didn't resist, lying still as Tom worked as layers of grime washed away. Tom's movements slowed. Something wasn't quite right. The face emerging from beneath the mud wasn't the round, puppy-like shape he'd expected. Instead, he found himself looking at a delicate, pointed snout. Sharp, triangular ears poked through the matted fur. When he gently cleaned one small paw, he noticed the slender digits were nothing like a dog's. His heart skipped a beat as he lifted the washcloth to reveal a distinctive white tip. "Tail, well, I'll be," he whispered, realization dawning. "You're a fox." Kit. Tom's hands stilled as he considered his options. The logical thing would be to call animal control. They'd know how to handle a wild animal. But as he looked down at the vulnerable creature on his counter, something in his chest tightened. The kit was so small, so helpless. Moving her now in this state felt wrong. Just for tonight, he decided aloud, continuing to clean her with gentle strokes. "You need rest more than anything else right now." As he worked, his mind wandered to the Bible verse about grace being sufficient in times of weakness. Looking at the tiny fox kit fighting so hard to survive, the name came to him naturally. "Grace," he said softly. "That's what I'll call you once she was clean." Tom wrapped Grace in a fluffy towel. Careful to keep her warm, he fashioned a small bed from a cardboard box, lining it with soft blankets and placing it in a quiet corner of the bathroom where she would feel secure. With tender movements, he transferred her into the makeshift nest. Grace curled into a tight ball, her breathing finally evening out as exhaustion took over. Tom watched her for a moment, his heart full of an unexpected protectiveness. "I don't know how you ended up here," he whispered, "but you're safe now." Quietly, he stepped out of the bathroom, leaving the door slightly ajar. Thunder rattled the windows of Tom's small cottage as he settled into his worn armchair, wrapping both hands around a steaming cup of chamomile tea. The living room lamp cast a warm glow against the dark storm outside, and his thoughts drifted to the tiny creature sleeping in his bathroom. What a strange turn this day had taken. He took a slow sip, letting the warm liquid soothe his nerves. The responsible thing would be to call animal control first thing in the morning. They had the expertise, the facilities, but something held him back. The memory of those frightened amber eyes, that trembling body that had gone still in his hands, trusting him completely. His mind wandered to darker places, to dusty streets, half a world away. How many times had he witnessed suffering and wished anyone would step in? How many times had protocol and procedure gotten in the way of simple human kindness? The weight of those memories pressed against his chest, familiar and heavy. Setting down his tea, Tom walked quietly to the bathroom. The door creaked softly as he pushed it open. Grace hadn't moved from her makeshift bed, her tiny body rising and falling with each breath under the clean towel. He could see how her ribs showed through her fur, how her legs seemed too thin to support even her small frame. She looked so fragile, like a candle flame that might go out with the slightest breeze. "Just look at you," he whispered, careful not to wake her. For the first time in years, Tom felt something stir inside him, a sense of purpose, clear and strong. This wasn't about protocol or proper procedures. This was about doing what was right, at least until she was strong enough to survive on her own. Grace needed someone in her corner. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and Tom couldn't bring himself to retreat to his bedroom down the hall. Instead, he grabbed his old blanket and a pillow from the linen closet. The couch wasn't particularly comfortable, but it was close enough to hear if Grace needed anything during the Night, as he settled onto the couch, the familiar sounds of rain and thunder seemed less threatening than before Tom pulled the blanket up to his chin, feeling an unfamiliar sense of peace despite the chaos of the storm. Outside, for the first time in longer than he could remember, he knew exactly what he needed to do. The first rays of sunlight crept through Tom's living room curtains, painting warm stripes across his face. He blinked awake, his back stiff from a night on the couch. For a moment, he wondered why he hadn't slept in his bed, then remembered Grace moving quietly. Tom padded to the bathroom. Grace was still curled up in her towel, her chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. Her white-tipped tail twitched slightly in sleep, and Tom noticed how thin it looked in the morning light. Though cleaned up, her frame remained frighteningly delicate, like a bird with hollow bones. In the kitchen, Tom switched on the small radio that kept him company during his morning routine. As he measured coffee grounds into the filter, the cheerful voice of the morning host filled a space with familiar chatter. He cracked eggs into a pan, letting them sizzle while reaching for a slice of bread. And now, for local news, the host tone shifted, becoming more serious. Recent reports of property damage in the Cedar Grove area have residents concerned. Several homeowners have reported broken fences and damaged gardens, with some blaming local wildlife, particularly foxes, for the destruction. Local authorities advised. Tom's hand froze mid-reach for the salt shaker. The words settled uncomfortably in his stomach as he thought of the tiny creature sleeping in his bathroom. He'd acted on instinct last night, driven by compassion, but now daylight brought new complications. What did he really know about caring for a wild fox? How could he ensure Grace recovered properly? His breakfast sat half-eaten as his mind churned through these thoughts. Tom knew he needed help, professional help, but also someone who would understand his desire to give Grace a chance. The memory of a community picnic from 2 summers ago surfaced in his mind. He'd met a veterinarian there, Mary Ann, who had spoken passionately about wildlife rehabilitation. She'd handed out flyers about her clinic services, and Tom was sure he pinned one to his kitchen corkboard. Standing up from his barely touched breakfast, Tom walked to the corkboard. Among the old receipts and reminder notes, he found what he was looking for: a slightly faded flyer from Mary Ann's veterinary clinic. His eyes scanned the page until he found the clinic hours, which he carefully copied onto a notepad. He glanced toward the bathroom where Grace slept, knowing he'd made the right decision. If anyone could help him navigate this situation, it would be Mary Ann. A short while later, Tom pulled into Mary Ann's veterinary clinic. The small building sat nestled among pine trees on the outskirts of town, its weathered signs swaying gently in the breeze. From the passenger seat came soft, rustling sounds from the pet carrier where Grace lay bundled in blankets. Inside, the clinic's waiting room felt warm and welcoming. Colorful posters lined the walls, showing local wildlife and conservation messages. The smell of coffee drifted from somewhere in the back, mixing with the clean, clinical scent of the space. Tom Randall, Mary Ann's voice carried across the empty waiting room as she emerged from her office. Her gray streak hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her eyes crinkled with genuine warmth. It's been ages. What brings you in today? Tom lifted the carrier carefully. I found someone who needs help in the exam room. Tom explained the previous night's rescue while Maran listened intently. When he opened the carrier, Grace blinked at the fluorescent lights shrinking back against the blankets. Poor little one, Mary Ann murmured, her experienced hands moving with gentle precision as she examined Grace. She's definitely undernourished, probably separated from her mother during the storm. She checked Grace's eyes, ears, and teeth with practiced ease. The good news is I don't see any serious injuries or illness. Tom watched anxiously as Mary Ann continued her examination. So she'll be okay with proper care, yes, but Tom, Mary Ann's expression grew serious. Raising a wild fox isn't simple. She needs specific nutrition to develop properly, and more importantly, we need to ensure she doesn't become too comfortable around humans. The goal is to return her to the wild. Eventually, Mary Ann moved to her desk, writing out detailed instructions. I'll give you a care plan, what to feed her, how to create a quiet space where she feels secure, but given the recent complaints about foxes in town, we need to keep this quiet some. folks aren't too fond of wildlife these days. She handed Tom several pages of notes in a small bag of specialized formula. I'll check in regularly to monitor her progress. Call me immediately if anything seems wrong. Tom clutched the supplies, feeling both relieved and overwhelmed. Thank you, Marianne. I really appreciate this. Just remember, she added, helping him secure Grace's carrier. What you're doing is kind, but it's also complicated. We need to be careful for Grace's sake and yours. Tom nodded, gathering Grace's carrier and the supplies. The weight of responsibility settled more firmly on his shoulders, but Marianne's guidance had given him confidence. He had helped now, and more importantly, he had a plan. That afternoon, Tom hammered together wooden panels in his backyard. The enclosure was taking shape, nothing fancy, but sturdy enough to give Grace a safe space to build her strength. He'd carefully positioned it behind some shrubs partially hidden from street view. The sound of footsteps on gravel made Tom pause. Mr. Grady, his neighbor from 3 houses down, stood at the fence, his weathered face creased with curiosity as he surveyed Tom's project. Afternoon, Tom Grady called out, resting his arms on the fence. Doing some building, I see. Tom nodded, keeping his movements casual. Despite his internal tension, just a small project, Mr. Grady. Must be something special to have you out here working in this heat. Grady's eyes roamed over the scattered lumber and wire mesh. Looks almost like some sort of pen. Just a garden box, Tom replied, wiping sweat from his forehead, thinking about growing some vegetables. A rustling sound drifted from the open window of Tom's house. Grady's head turned sharply toward the noise. That you're heating acting up again sounds strange for this time of year. Yeah, old system's been making noise lately. Need to get it checked. Tom stacked some boards, trying to look busy. Grady shifted his weight, not moving from his spot. You know, I haven't seen you at the shelter lately. Taking some time off to focus on home projects. Just a few days, Tom answered, his tone remaining friendly but reserved. Getting lonely out here by yourself? Great. Depressed, maybe thinking about getting a pet? Haven't given it much thought, Tom said, straightening up and stretching his back. After what felt like an eternity, Grady finally stepped back from the fence. Well, don't work too hard out here. See you around, Tom. Tom watched as Grady ambled down the street, stopping briefly to chat with another neighbor through the kitchen window. He could see Grady gesturing back toward his yard. Later that afternoon, Tom sat at his usual booth at Mary's Diner picking up his coffee order. He overheard Grady's distinctive voice from across the room, speaking to a small group of regulars. Something's different over at Tom Randall's place, Grady was saying. Building some kind of cage in his backyard. Heard strange noises coming from inside his house, too. Tom collected his coffee quickly and left the bell above the door, chiming his exit back home. He found Grace curled up in her boxer russet for catching the late afternoon light. She lifted her head as he approached, her dark eyes trusting. Tom's stomach tightened with worry as he thought about Grady's suspicious glances and probing questions. The evening settled softly around Tom's cottage as he sat in his worn leather armchair, watching Grace with gentle amusement. The small fox had grown noticeably stronger over the past few days. Her russet fur now gleamed with health, no longer matted and muddy as it had been on that stormy night. Tom rolled up an old wool sock and tossed it gently across the room. Grace's ears perked up, her dark eyes following the movement. After a moment's hesitation, she pounced, grabbing to the sock with her tiny teeth and shaking it vigorously. That's a girl, Tom said, quietly, a smile tugging at his lips as Grace played. Tom felt something shift inside him, the familiar weight of loneliness that had been his constant companion since retiring from the army seemed lighter. Somehow, he thought back to the faces of young soldiers who had sought his guidance, their eyes filled with fear and hope. Some of those faces still haunted his dreams, the ones he couldn't save, the ones whose last moments he had witnessed. But here in this moment, watching Grace attack the sock with playful determination, those memories felt less sharp. Her survival, her growing strength, gave him a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. Tom reached into a paper bag beside his chair and pulled out a small stuffed mouse he'd bought at the pet store that morning. He squeezed it, making it squeak, and Grace's head whipped around at the sound, her whole body tensed with curiosity as she crouched low, stalking toward the new Toya laugh escaped Tom's throat as Grace pounced on the mouse, tumbling head. Over tail in her enthusiasm, the sound surprised him. He couldn't remember the last time he'd laughed like that freely, and without reservation Grace looked up at the noise. The mouse DK ling from her mouth, and Tom could have sworn she looked pleased with herself. For nearly an hour, they played together in the quiet living room. Grace chased the mouse, retrieved the sock, and occasionally paused to investigate Tom. Slippers, her playful nature, growing more evident with each passing minute. When Grace finally began to tire, Tom gathered her gently in his arms. She didn't struggle, instead curling trustingly against his chest as he placed her in her bed, a cozy box lined with soft blankets. Tom realized how much the small creature had already changed him. The constant burden of guilt he'd carried since his military days felt lighter, as if Grace's presence was slowly helping to heal wounds he thought would never close. "Good night, little one," he whispered, making sure she was comfortable in her bed. "Thank you for finding me." Tom pushed his cart down the grocery store aisle, scanning the shelves for the items Marianne had recommended for Grace's diet. He reached for a can of chicken, checking the ingredients carefully. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as he added several cans to his cart, along with a carton of goat's milk. "Third attack this month," a woman's voice drifted from the next aisle. "The Hendersons lost 2 chickens just last night. It has to be Fox's," another woman responded. "Sarah told me Mr. Grady mentioned something strange going on at Tom Randall's place. Said he's been building something in his backyard." Tom's hand froze mid-reach for another can. His heart beat faster, but he forced himself to move naturally, dropping the can into his cart with deliberate casualness. At the checkout counter, Pete Davidson, who'd run the register for as long as anyone could remember, shook his head as he scanned Tom's items. "Heard about the attacks?" Pete asked, his weathered face creasing with concern. "These wild animals are getting too bold. Foxes especially. Nothing but trouble if you ask me. Mess with people's property, kill livestock. Town needs to do something about it. Is that right?" Tom kept his voice neutral, though his fingers tightened around his wallet. "Sure. Is my cousin over in Cedar Grove. They had to organize a hunt last spring. Only way to deal with these pests." Tom nodded stiffly, paid for his groceries, and hurried out to his truck. As he drove home, he noticed Mrs. Baker and the Thompsons gathered by their mailboxes. Their conversation stopped abruptly as he passed, and he felt their eyes following his truck. That evening, Tom measured out Grace's dinner with careful precision, watching as she ate with growing strength and vigor. Her trust in him showed in the way she no longer startled at his movements, and how she'd curl up near his feet while he read. The sunset painted long shadows across his front porch as Tom settled into his old wooden chair. After dinner, he watched cars pass on the quiet street, each one causing a slight tension in his shoulders. A couple walked their dog on the opposite sidewalk, and Tom noticed how they quickened their pace as they passed his house. He thought about Grace safely tucked away inside, and about the growing whispers in town. The weight of protecting her seemed heavier now, matched only by his determination to see her healthy and strong enough to return to the wild. But until then, he knew every trip to town, every interaction with neighbors would require careful consideration. The evening air grew cooler as Tom sat there contemplating the delicate balance between helping Grace and keeping her presence hidden from increasingly suspicious eyes. The morning sun filtered through the trees as Tom parked his truck at the edge of the conservation area. He checked the pet carrier one more time, making sure Grace was comfortable inside. The early hour meant few hikers would be around, perfect for giving Grace a taste of the outdoors. "Just a little adventure today," Tom whispered, carrying the carrier down a narrow trail. He walked carefully until he found a small clearing sheltered by thick bushes and tall pines. After scanning the area to ensure they were alone, he set down the carrier and opened its door. Grace poked her nose out cautiously, whiskers twitching as she sampled the morning air. Her paws touched the grass tentatively at first, then with growing confidence. Tom watched, smiling, as she investigated fallen leaves and interesting twigs. The morning breeze carried the sweet scent of wildflowers, and patches of sunlight danced on the forest floor. Grace's tail swished with excitement as she discovered new scents, her natural curiosity growing stronger. Each day, then it happened a sharp, haunting cry pierced the morning quiet Tom's body. Tensed, and his breath caught in his throat, Grace froze mid-step her ears. Suddenly alert and forward, the cry came again, longer this time, filled with a mournful yearning that made Tom's skin prickle. Without hesitation, Tom scooped Grace up and placed her back in the carrier. His hands trembled slightly as he secured the door the cry had sounded. So desperate, so cing back home, Tom paced his living room, phone in hand. When Marianne answered, he described everything: the cry, Grace's reaction, the gnawing feeling in his gut. It definitely sounds like an adult. Fox, Marianne confirmed, her voice thoughtful, and given the location and timing, it could very well be Grace's mother still searching for her kid. What should I do? Tom's voice cracked slightly. You've done everything right so far, Tom, Marianne assured him, but we need to consider what's best for Grace in the long run. If her mother is still in the area, reuniting them might be the most natural solution. After hanging up, Tom settled into his armchair, watching Grace curl up in her favorite spot near the window. The afternoon light caught her fur, highlighting how much healthier she looked compared to that stormy night. But now, instead of pride time, Tom felt a heavy mix of doubt and guilt weighing on his chest. Grace's gentle breathing filled the quiet room as she drifted off to sleep, unaware of Tom's internal struggle. He sat there motionless, torn between his growing attachment to Grace and the possibility that somewhere in those woods her real family was still searching. For the morning light crept through Tom's kitchen window, but he barely noticed it. His hands moved automatically as he cleaned Grace's enclosure, his thoughts far away in the forest where that mournful cry still echoed in his memory. The fresh bedding and water bowl felt like hollow gestures now weighted with new doubt. He paused, leaning against the counter, watching Grace explore her surroundings. She had grown stronger, her movements more confident and precise. A small rubber ball rolled across the floor, and Grace pounced on it with perfect timing. Her natural instincts sharp and clear, her white-tipped tail swished with satisfaction as she batted the toy around. The sight brought a sad smile to Tom's face. He remembered a young soldier in his unit who once said, sometimes the hardest thing and the right thing are the same thing. Chaplain, those words had guided him through difficult decisions during his service, and now they returned with new meaning. Grace darted past him, chasing a shadow, her movements fluid and wild. There was nothing domestic about her anymore. She was pure nature, temporarily contained within his walls. The realization sat heavy in his chest. Later that afternoon, Tom found himself sitting across from Marianne in her small clinic office. Certificates and wildlife photographs decorated the walls, but he focused on his hands clasped tightly in his lap. I keep thinking about that cry in the woods, Tom admitted, his voice rough with emotion. What if I'm standing in the way of something important? Marianne leaned forward, her expression gentle but firm. You saved Grace's life, Tom. Never doubt that, but loving something sometimes means knowing when to let it go. She reached across her desk, placing a reassuring hand on his arm. Grace is getting stronger every day, and that's thanks to you. But she's a wild animal, and her true home is out there, I know. Tom nodded, swallowing hard. I didn't expect to care this much. That's what makes you special, Tom. You have a big heart, but the best thing we can do for Grace is prepare her for the life she was meant to live. The truth of Marianne's words settled around him like a heavy blanket as he left the clinic. Stepping into the afternoon sunlight, Tom carried both the weight of what he needed to do and the first glimmer of acceptance that it was right. The following morning, Tom sat at his kitchen table, a blank notepad before him and a cup of coffee. Growing cold at his elbows, sunlight streamed through the window, casting warm patches on the wooden surface where his pen tapped rhythmically. His military training had taught him that the best way to tackle any mission was with proper planning and clear objectives. He jotted down nature walk day at the top of the page, underlining it twice below. He listed potential activities: guided tours, wildlife facts, photography, displays. Each item sparked new possibilities, and soon his neat handwriting filled half the page. The phone rang, and Tom quickly dialed Marianne's clinic number. Her enthusiasm was immediate and Infectious, that's brilliant. Tom. Marianne's voice carried genuine excitement. We could set up educational stations along the conservation trail. I have some wonderful photographs of local wildlife we could display. Do you think people would come? Tom asked, uncertainty creeping into his voice. If we make it engaging and family-friendly, absolutely. I could do a short talk about wildlife behavior and how to coexist safely with our wild neighbors. They spent the next hour planning details, Marianne suggested, including activities for children like animal track identification and a scavenger hunt for native plants. Tom took careful notes, his earlier anxiety giving way to purposeful energy. Later that afternoon, Tom walked into the community center, his folder of ideas tucked under his arm. The building's familiar wooden floors creaked beneath his feet as he approached the front desk. Mrs. Peterson, the elderly coordinator, peered at him over her reading glasses. A nature walk event, she repeated after he explained his request. Well, that's different. Usually folks just want to complain about the wildlife. That's exactly why we need this, Tom said quietly, to help people understand rather than fear. While Mrs. Peterson checked the calendar, Tom noticed Bill Harper, one of the local shop owners, listening nearby. Sounds like tree hugger nonsense to me, Bill muttered, but there was more curiosity than malice in his tone. It's about being good neighbors, Tom replied calmly, even with the four-legged kind. Back home, Tom spread his materials across the dining room table. He began organizing his presentation, drawing from his experience as a chaplain to craft a message that would resonate with the community. He included practical tips about securing garbage cans and protecting livestock, alongside gentle reminders about the beauty and importance of local wildlife. Grace watched from her enclosure, her bright eyes following his movements. Tom paused in his work, observing how she had grown stronger and more alert. Her presence reminded him why this effort mattered so much. Setting down his pen, he felt a familiar sense of purpose settling over him, the same feeling that had guided him through his years of service, now directed toward a different kind of mission. The morning sun cast long shadows across the conservation areas. Tom and Marianne arranged pamphlets and wildlife photographs on a folding table. The air held a crisp autumn freshness, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and damp earth. They had arrived early, wanting everything to be perfect for the nature walk day. Did you bring the track casting examples? Tom asked, adjusting a display board showing local wildlife habitats. Right here, Marin replied, setting down a box containing plaster casts of various animal prints. And Grace is ready in the carrier. People began arriving in small clusters, their footsteps crunching on the gravel path. Some hung back, arms crossed, and expressions guarded, while others approached the display table with open curiosity. Children tugged at their parents' sleeves, pointing at the colorful photographs. Marianne stepped forward to address the growing crowd, her voice clear and confident. Welcome, everyone. Today, we're going to learn about some of our most misunderstood neighbors, particularly our local foxes. She went on to explain their role in controlling rodent populations and maintaining the delicate balance of the ecosystem. Tom followed with his own story, carefully choosing his words. A few months ago, I encountered a situation that changed my perspective on these creatures, he began describing. Finding Grace without revealing she still lived with him, his voice carried the warmth of genuine emotion as he spoke about the intelligence and gentle nature he had witnessed as the group prepared for their walk. Mariamne brought out Grace on a special harness. A collective gasp rose from the crowd. Grace's red fur gleamed in the morning light as she took tentative steps forward, her ears twitching at the new sounds and scents. Can we pet her? A small girl asked, her eyes wide with wonder. Very gently, Marianne instructed, keeping a careful hold on the leash. Remember, she's still a wild animal, but she's helping us learn today. One by one, children approached under their parents' watchful eyes. Grace remained calm, accepting their gentle touches with surprising patience. Her natural charm worked its magic on the crowd. Even Mr. Harper, who had been particularly vocal about the fox problem, stepped closer for a better look. Well, I'll be, he muttered, watching Grace interact with a young boy. She's nothing like what I expected. The skeptical murmurs that had marked the beginning of the event gradually transformed into excited conversations and Questions elderly Mrs. Thompson, who had initially stood at the back of the group, now leaned forward on her cane. Smiling as she watched the children's delight, I remember seeing foxes when I was a girl, she shared with those nearby. They were always more scared of us than we were of them. As the guided walk concluded, people gathered around Tom and Mary Ann eager to learn more. Questions flowed freely, ranging from what to do if they encountered a fox to how they could help protect local wildlife. The morning's stiff formality had melted away, replaced by genuine interest and understanding. The morning after the nature walk, Tom knelt beside Grace's outdoor enclosure, watching her explore. With newfound confidence, sunlight filtered through the branches above, casting dappled shadows on her russet fur. Her playful bounds and quick, precise movements reminded him of yesterday's event, where she had charmed even the most skeptical towns people. He smiled, remembering Mrs. Thompson's complete transformation from weary observer to enthusiastic supporter. The image of children gathering around Grace, their faces bright with wonder, stayed with him. Even Mr. Harper, who had been so vocal about the fox problem, had asked thoughtful questions. By the end of the walk at his desk later that morning, Tom spread out several sheets of paper, jotting down ideas for future community events. Wildlife photography workshop, he wrote, then added local ecosystem presentation and children's nature day. His pen moved quickly as more ideas flowed, his excitement growing with each new possibility. The gentle knock at his door announced Mary Ann's arrival. She entered with her usual warm smile, carrying her veterinary bag. "You won't believe what I heard at the grocery store this morning," she said, setting down her things. "Mrs. Peterson and her entire bridge club were talking about the nature walk. They're actually asking when we'll do another one." Tom's eyes lit up. "Really? That's wonderful news." While Mary Ann checked on Grace's health, Tom worked on expanding the enclosure, adding new branches and hiding spots that would help develop her natural instincts. Grace darted between the new features, her movements becoming more confident and precise with each passing day. "She's getting stronger," Mary Ann observed, watching Grace leap gracefully from one branch to another. "And did you notice how she's starting to cache her food? Those instincts are definitely kicking." And Tom nodded, pride warming his chest. He reached for his phone, scrolling through the list of contacts he'd collected at the nature walk. Several residents had expressed interest in helping with future events, including young Jemia Wilson, whose parents ran the local hardware store. "I think we're really making a difference," Tom said, quietly watching Grace investigate a new hollow log he'd added to her space for the first time since leaving the service. "I feel like I'm doing something that matters," Mary, and squeezed his shoulder gently. "You are, Tom, you definitely are." As evening settled and Tom sat in his favorite porch chair, the wood creaking comfortably beneath him, Grace rested in her carrier nearby, her presence a calming constant. Above them, stars began to appear in the darkening sky, twinkling like distant beacons. The cool evening air carried the soft sounds of crickets and distant owls, nature's gentle reminder of the wild world they were working to protect. Tom felt a deep sense of purpose settle over him, stronger than anything he'd experienced since his military days. Here in this quiet moment, he knew with certainty that his mission to protect Grace and educate others about wildlife was exactly where he needed to be. 2 days after the nature walk, Tom pushed open the glass door of Pete's diner, the familiar bell chiming above his head. The usual morning buzz seemed different today, heavier, charged with tension. In the corner booth, a group of ranchers hunched over their coffee cups, their voices carrying across the half-empty restaurant. "Lost 3 chickens last night," one of them growled, his weathered face twisted in anger. "Something tore right through the fence. Had to be a fox," another added, stabbing his fork into his eggs. "Nothing else around here hunts like that." Tom's stomach tightened as he slid onto a stool at the counter. Pete approached with a coffee pot, his usual friendly smile noticeably absent. "Speaking of foxes," a third rancher said louder, clearly meant for Tom to hear, "wasn't there one at that nature thing the other day? The one the chaplain was showing off?" The diner grew quieter, and Tom felt eyes boring into his back. He focused on stirring cream into his coffee, trying to appear casual while his mind Grace had been safely enclosed the entire time. There was no way she could have done this. Orders up, Pete announced flatly, sliding a plate of toast and eggs. In front of Tom, the food looked less appetizing by the second as whispers continued behind him. When Tom stood to leave, several customers turned away, avoiding his gaze. Others stared openly there, expressions ranging from suspicion to outright hostility. He left money on the counter and headed for the door, the weight of accusation following him out. The morning sun fell harsh and exposing as he walked to his truck. Mrs. Peterson, who had been so enthusiastic about the nature walk, crossed the street to avoid him too. Women outside the post office stopped talking abruptly as he passed, their eyes following his movement. Tom's driveway came into view, but Mr. Grady was waiting, their arms crossed over his chest. The neighbor's usually ruddy face was flushed with anger. "We need to talk about that wild animal you're keeping," Randall Grady declared, stepping forward. "Those chickens didn't kill themselves, and everyone knows you've got that box, Mr. Grady." "You're mistaken," Tom replied, keeping his voice steady despite his racing heart. "I don't have any dangerous animals. Don't lie to me." GRD's voice rose. "We all saw it at your little nature show. You brought danger right into our community, and now look what's happened." Tom maintained his composure, though he could feel his hands trembling slightly. "I understand you're upset, but you're wrong about this. I suggest you leave my property." Grady's eyes narrowed. "This isn't over, Randall. The town won't stand for this." He turned and stalked away, leaving Tom standing in his driveway, surrounded by the weight of suspicion and fear. Inside his house, Tom found Grace curled up in her favorite spot. She lifted her head as he approached, and he gathered her gently in his arms. The fox's warm presence provided little comfort as he considered how quickly the community's newfound understanding had crumbled. The accusations hung heavy in the air, threatening everything he'd worked to build. The following afternoon, a sharp knock echoed through Tom's quiet house. Through the window, he spotted two men in official-looking uniform standing on his porch. His heart sank as he recognized Frank Miller, the county animal control office officer, and Dave Thompson from the town council. "Mr. Randall," Frank began, his tone formal but stern, "we've received multiple complaints about a fox being kept on your property. Given the recent livestock attack, we need to address this situation." Tom invited them inside, conscious of the curtains twitching in neighboring windows. The officials remained standing, their postures rigid with authority. "We understand you've been caring for a wild animal," Dave said, consulting a notepad. "While your intentions might be good, this poses serious concerns for public safety. Grace has been under my constant supervision," Tom explained, keeping his voice steady. "She's never left her enclosure unsupervised, and she was secured during the night of the attack." Frank shook his head. "Mr. Randall, we can't just take your word for it. Wild animals are unpredictable, and if this fox is responsible for any damage or injury, you'll be held liable. This is your official warning," Dave added, handing Tom a yellow form. "We strongly advise you to reconsider keeping the fox. The next step would involve more serious measures." After they left, Tom stood in his doorway, watching them drive away. Mrs. Peterson across the street quickly pulled her curtain shut when he glanced her way. The Johnsons next door stopped their yard work to stare, their disapproval evident in their rigid postures. With trembling fingers, Tom dialed Mary Ann's number. She answered on the second ring. "They're trying to force me to give her up," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Stay calm, Tom," Marin replied softly. "We both know Grace isn't responsible for the attack. The truth will come out. These things always do. Focus on keeping her safe and well cared for." Taking Mary Ann's advice to heart, Tom spent the afternoon checking every inch of Grace's enclosure. He reinforced the corners with additional wire, tested each latch twice, and added an extra padlock for good measure. Through it all, Grace watched him curiously, occasionally pawing at his shoes when he stood still too long. The whispers traveled through the neighborhood like wind through dry leaves. Tom could feel them as he worked in the slam of a car door, in the huddle of women by the mailboxes in the way. Mr. Grady's grandchildren were hurried inside when they walked past his yard. As evening approached, Tom settled onto his porch chair, watching Grace explore her newly reinforced space. She pounced on a toy rolled in the fresh hay, He laid down and stretched contentedly in the last rays of sunlight. Despite his exhaustion, despite the weight of the warning notice sitting on his kitchen table, Tom felt a surge of determination. Grace deserved better than to be judged by fear and misunderstanding. The house was silent, except for the soft crackling of the fireplace, its warm glow casting dancing shadows across Tom's living room. In his worn recliner, Tom sat motionless, his weathered hands gripping the armrests as his eyes fixed on the dying embers from her enclosure in the corner. Grace's gentle breathing added a peaceful rhythm to the quiet evening, her small form curled into a tight ball of russet fur. Tom's mind wandered through the day, events like leaves caught in a bitter wind, the stern faces of the officials, their warning notice still sitting heavy on his kitchen table, seemed to mock him. The neighbors' suspicious glances and hurried retreats into their homes had cut deeper than he'd expected. Even Mr. Grady, who used to share gardening tips over the fence, now only offered cold stares. Exhaustion weighed on Tom's shoulders as he considered the simplest solution: surrendering Grace to animal control. One phone call could end the whispers, the accusations, the mounting pressure from the community. His life could return to its quiet, uncomplicated routine. As if sensing his troubled thoughts, Grace shifted in her sleep, her small paw twitching as she dreamed. Tom's gaze drifted to her enclosure, watching her chest rise and fall with each peaceful breath. The sight of her so vulnerable and trusting stirred something deep within him. The memory of that stormy night flooded back, Grace shivering in the mud, her eyes wide with fear and desperation. He remembered how she'd felt in his arms, barely weighing anything at all, her tiny heart racing against his palm. The image of her alone and frightened cut through his doubts like a knife through fog. Tom straightened in his chair, his jaw set with renewed purpose. The town's fear came from a place of misunderstanding. He knew that now Grace wasn't the menace they imagined. She was proof that compassion could bridge the gap between wild and tame. Rising from his recliner, Tom felt determination replace his weariness. He moved quietly to Grace's enclosure, watching her sleep for a moment. "We'll figure this out, Grace," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the dying fire. The morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot as Tom pulled up to Mary Ann's clinic. His truck's tires crunched on the gravel as he parked, matching the grinding worry in his chest. Through the clinic's front window, he could see Mary Ann organizing files at her desk, her familiar presence already offering a measure of comfort. The bell above the door chimed as he entered. Mary Ann looked up, her warm smile fading slightly as she noticed the deep lines of concern etched on Tom's face. "Tom," she said softly, "come on back to my office." He followed her through the quiet clinic, past empty examination rooms that smelled of antiseptic and fresh bandages. Her office was small but welcoming, with wildlife photographs covering the walls and a comfortable chair that Tom sank into gratefully. "It's getting worse," he began, his voice steady despite his obvious exhaustion. "The officials came yesterday. They're saying Grace might be responsible for the livestock attack. The neighbors won't even look at me anymore." Mary Ann listened carefully, her hands folded on her desk. When Tom finished speaking, she leaned forward slightly. "You've done something remarkable, Tom." That nature walk opened eyes and hearts. "We can't let fear and misunderstanding undo all that progress." She reached for a notepad, her practical nature taking over. "What we need is evidence, real solid proof that Grace couldn't have been involved in the attack. When did it happen? Where exactly?" Tom straightened in his chair, catching her meaning. "Johnson's ranch, just outside town. Must have been 2 nights ago." "Perfect," Mary Ann said, jotting notes. "I can help you investigate, look for tracks, examine the damage pattern. Different predators leave different signs. If we can prove it wasn't a fox, or at least show that Grace was secure during the attack, we can counter these accusations with facts." Tom felt something shift inside him, a spark of hope replacing the heavy dread he'd been carrying. Mary Ann's confidence, her practical approach to solving the problem made the situation feel less overwhelming. "The truth matters," she continued, her voice firm but kind, "and the town will listen to reason if we present it properly. They're scared right now, but fear can't stand up to facts and patience." As they discussed the details of their investigation, Tom felt his shoulders relaxing for the first time in Days Marianne's unwavering support and clear-headed planning gave him something solid to hold on to, a path forward through the chaos of accusations and suspicion. When he finally stood to leave, the morning sun had climbed higher in the sky, filling the office with warm light. Marianne walked him to the door, her presence steady and reassuring. "Thank you," Tom said, simply meaning far more than just the immediate help she'd offered. The weight that had been crushing him felt lighter as he walked back to his truck. Each step seemed easier than the last. Purpose replacing uncertainty. They had a plan now, a way to fight back against the fear that had gripped the town. Tom's boots clicked softly against Elena's brick walkway as he approached her modest home. That afternoon, the retired teacher had shown genuine interest during the nature walk, asking thoughtful questions and even staying behind to learn more about foxes. Her kitchen warm and fragrant with the scent of chamomile tea provided a welcome refuge from the tension that had gripped the town. "It's not right how quickly people jump to conclusions," Elena said, pouring tea into delicate cups. Her silver hair caught the afternoon light streaming through lace curtains. "I saw how gentle Grace was with the children at the walk. She's not the monster they're making her out to be." Tom wrapped his hands around the warm cup, drawing comfort from Elena's understanding. He explained his plan to gather evidence, watching relief flood his face as she nodded in agreement. "Samuel might help too," Ella suggested. "He's always been one to look at things logically." They found Samuel in his workshop, surrounded by tools in the scent of sawdust. The handyman listened carefully, his weathered hands still working on a cabinet door, as Tom explained the situation. "Fear makes folks unreasonable," Samuel said, setting down his sandpaper, "but evidence that's something concrete they can't ignore." He walked to a dusty shelf and pulled out an old trail camera bin. "Using this to track deer might come in handy." The small group gathered around Samuel's workbench, spreading out a local map. Marianne had joined them, her veterinary expertise proving invaluable, as she pointed out likely travel patterns for different predators. "Look for these types of tracks," she explained, sketching quick diagrams. "A fox print is distinctly different from a coyote or domestic dog, and the attack pattern on livestock can tell us a lot about what kind of predator we're dealing with." Samuel held his trail camera. "We can set this up near Johnson's ranch. If there's something else out there, we'll catch it on film." The afternoon light was growing soft as they finalized their plans. Tom looked around at these unexpected allies, Elena with her quiet determination, Samuel's practical support, and Marianne's steady guidance. For the first time since the accusations began, he felt the warmth of community. Replac, ing the cold grip of isolation. The evening air held a chill as Tom's truck pulled into Samuel's gravel driveway. Marianne's car was already parked outside the handyman's small house, its headlights still cooling in the darkness inside. Samuel hunched over his laptop at the kitchen table, the blue glow of the screen illuminating his intense expression. "You need to see this," Samuel said, barely glancing up as Tom entered. "Got some clear footage around midnight last night." Tom and Marianne gathered around the laptop as Samuel clicked through the video files. The night vision footage showed the ranch's fence line in ghostly green tones. At first, there was only the gentle sway of grass and the wind, then movement caught their attention. There, Marianne pointed, "Watch the bottom right corner." A fox emerged from the shadow, notably larger than Grace. Its movements were precise and predatory as it stalked along the fence line. When it turned sideways, the camera captured a distinctive feature that made Tom lean in closer. That scar on its flank, Marianne observed, tapping the screen. "See how it creates a visible mark in the fur? This is definitely not Grace." Samuel rewound the footage several times, allowing them to study the fox's behavior. "Look at the size difference," he noted. "This one's fully grown, probably male given the build. Grace isn't half this size." Marianne pulled out her phone and showed them photos she'd taken of Grace during her examinations. The paw prints would be different too. "This fox leaves deeper impressions. You can see them clearly in the mud here." She pointed to several frames where the animal's tracks were visible. "This is what we needed," Tom said, his voice thick with relief. "Actual proof." The group spent the next hour reviewing the footage multiple times, with Marianne documenting the key differences between the wild fox and Grace. Samuel jotted down notes, preparing for his conversation with the rancher. "I'll talk to Johnson tomorrow. Samuel said, closing his laptop. He's practical enough to understand evidence when he sees it once he's convinced. Others will follow. We should call another community meeting, Marianne suggested, gathering her notes, but this time we'll have concrete proof to share. We can explain the differences between Grace and wild foxes, show the footage, and help people understand that not every incident involves the same animal. Tom sat back in his chair, feeling the weight of accusation lifting from his shoulders. The truth was finally in there. Hands captured in clear, undeniable images, he looked at his friend Samuel, methodically organizing the video files, Marianne reviewing her documentation, and felt profound gratitude for their unwavering support. Thank you, he said simply, his voice carrying the depth of his appreciation. Both of you, I couldn't have done this alone. The next morning, Tom sat in his kitchen with papers scattered on his worn oak table. Marianne sat with perfect posture, her veterinary expertise evident in the precise way she organized their evidence. Samuel leaned back in his chair, laptop balanced on his knee, while Elena sorted through her handwritten notes about fox behavior. We need to start with the hard evidence, Marianne said, tapping the printed screenshots from the trail camera. The size comparison between the wild fox and Grace will be crucial. People need to see the difference immediately. Tom nodded, pen hovering over his notepad. Words came slowly as he tried to capture the essence of his experience with Grace. How could he explain the way her trust had helped heal his own wounded spirit? The pen scratched against paper as he wrote, crossed out, and rewrote his thoughts. Samuel clicked through the footage again, frame by frame. Look here, he said, pointing to a clear shot of the scarred fox. You can see the marking plain as day. No one can argue with this evidence. Elena spread her draft hand out across the table. I've included diagrams showing typical fox territories and hunting patterns, she explained. It helped show why Grace couldn't possibly be responsible for the attacks. During their lunch break, Tom stepped outside. Grace bounded playfully in her enclosure, chasing a fallen leaf. She had grown stronger, her coat glossy and healthy. Watching her, Tom felt a mixture of pride and sadness. She was becoming more fox-like every day, less dependent on him. Back inside, they took turns practicing their presentations. Marianne spoke with quiet authority about the evidence, her words clear and scientific. Samuel described the camera setup with the practical confidence of someone who knew his craft. When Tom's turn came, his voice wavered at first, but grew stronger as he shared his story. Remember, Marin advised, stick to the facts, but don't be afraid to show your humanity. Your connection with Grace is part of what makes this story powerful. As evening approached, Tom stood alone in his living room, running through his speech one final time. The words felt different in the quiet house, more intimate than a presentation. Each sentence carried the weight of his hope for understanding, his prayer that the town would see what he had learned about compassion and coexistence through grace. Through grace, he practiced saying, his voice soft in the dimming light, I've learned that sometimes the things we fear most are the very things that can teach us the most about kindness. The community center buzzed with nervous energy as residents filed in, filling the rows of metal folding chairs. The fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow over the concerned faces of farmers, shopkeepers, and families. Tom sat rigidly in the front row beside Marianne, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Samuel and Elena flanked them, offering quiet support. Council President Martha Jenkins called the meeting to order with 3 sharp raps of her gavel. We're here tonight to address the recent livestock attacks and concerns about wild animals in our community, she announced, her voice carrying through the packed room. When Marianne stepped up to the podium, she moved with calm authority. The projector hummed to life, casting its blue-white beam onto the wall. What you're about to see was captured 3 nights ago. She began, clicking through to the footage. The room fell silent as the video played, showing the scarred fox prowling near the livestock pens. Its distinctive marking was unmistakable in the infrared light. Note the size difference, Marin pointed out, switching to a side-by-side comparison with Grace. The fox responsible for the attacks is significantly larger and bears a prominent scar along its flank. Samuel took the podium next, his weathered hands gesturing as he explained the camera's placement. I've used this equipment for years, he said. The timestamp and location data are embedded in the footage. There's no room for doubt about what we're seeing. Then it was Tom's turn. His legs felt heavy as he approached the podium. But when he looked out at the sea of faces, he found his voice 3 weeks ago. During the worst storm of the season, I found Grace in a muddy ditch, he began. She was barely alive, just a tiny bundle of wet fur. His voice cracked slightly as he continued, sharing how caring for Grace had awakened something in him he thought he'd lost after my time as an army chaplain. I carried so much guilt about those I couldn't save, he admitted, but Grace, she showed me that sometimes the smallest act of kindness can make the biggest difference. The room remained silent. Dozens of eyes fixed on Tom as he spoke. He described Grace's recovery, her playful nature, and how she had brought together a small group of people who saw beyond their initial fears. I know now that Grace needs more than I can give her, Tom said, his voice steady despite the emotion behind his words. She deserves to live freely among her own kind. That's why I'm asking for your support in relocating her to the wildlife sanctuary just outside of town. As Tom's final words hung in the air, the room fell completely silent. The earlier hostility had dissolved, replaced by thoughtful expressions and softened gazes. He stood at the podium for a moment longer, looking out at his neighbors, hoping they could understand what Grace had taught him about second chances and healing. After Tom's final words faded, silence filled the community center. Then a slight rustling sound drew everyone's attention as Mrs. Lillian Marks, her silver hair neatly pinned back, slowly rose from her seat in the third row. If I may, she began, her voice gentle but clear. I've lived in this town for 63 years, and I've always feared wild animals, especially foxes. She adjusted her glasses and smiled, but at the nature walk, I saw something different. I saw Grace, and she wasn't the fearsome creature I'd imagined. She was gentle, curious, almost shy. Mrs. Marks's words seemed to break a dam. Another resident stood up. Then another. Sarah from the bakery shared how her children hadn't stopped talking about Grace since the nature walk. Bill Thompson, who owned the hardware store, admitted he changed his mind after seeing the evidence. The town council members exchanged glances and quiet words. Mayor Wilson cleared his throat and addressed the room. Given the evidence presented and the community's input, the council approves the relocation of Grace to the wildlife sanctuary under Dr. Marianne Cooper's supervision. Applause erupted through the room. Tom's shoulders relaxed as the tension he'd been carrying melted away. Marianne squeezed his arm supportively while already pulling out her phone to begin coordinating the relocation details with the sanctuary. People gathered around Tom in small groups, offering words of support and appreciation. Even those who had been skeptical seemed touched by the evening's events. Elena and Samuel stood nearby, beaming with pride at what their small team had accomplished. Mr. GR approached Tom last, shuffling his feet slightly while he said, clearing his throat, "Can't argue with that camera footage. Sorry for causing such a fuss." He extended his hand. "Good luck with getting the little one settled." Tom shook his neighbor's hand, noting how the earlier hostility had transformed into something approaching understanding. As the crowd began to disperse, Tom stepped outside into the evening air. The stars sparkled overhead, bright and clear, matching the lightness he felt in his heart. The morning sun cast long shadows across Tom's driveway as he carefully lifted Grace's carrier into his truck. The familiar weight felt different today, heavier with the knowledge that this would be their final journey together. Marianne stood beside her car, offering a gentle smile as Tom secured the carrier. "Ready?" she asked softly. Tom nodded, unable to find words just yet. They drove in convoy, their vehicles winding through the countryside toward the wildlife sanctuary. The morning air was crisp, and patches of fog still clung to the low-lying areas. Tom glanced occasionally at Grace through the carrier's ventilation holes, remembering the tiny mud-covered kit he'd found in the storm. The sanctuary gates appeared ahead, their wrought iron framework decorated with nature motifs. A conservation officer named David met them in the parking area, his khaki uniform neat and professional. He greeted them warmly, clipboard in hand. "We've prepared a supervised transition area," David explained, leading them down a well-maintained path. "It'll help Grace adjust gradually before joining the wider sanctuary population at the release point." Tom set The carrier down gently, his hands trembled slightly as he unlatched the door. Grace hesitated at first, then stepped out onto the soft earth. Her red fur gleamed in the morning light as she took tentative steps forward. She paused, turning to look back at Tom, her bright eyes meeting his. Tom's chest tightened at the sight. In that moment, he saw not just the frightened kid he'd rescued, but the bridge he'd become between his isolated past and a future filled with purpose and connection. Her Grace's tail swished gently as she held his gaze. She's going to do wonderfully here, Marianne said softly, placing a steadying hand on Tom's shoulder. David nodded in agreement. We'll keep a close eye on her progress. You're welcome to schedule visits to check on her adaptation. Grace took a few more steps toward the wooded area, her natural instincts drawing her toward the cover of trees. She paused once more at the forest's edge, as if gathering courage for her new beginning. Goodbye, Grace, Tom whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Thank you. They watched as Grace disappeared into the dappled shadows of the sanctuary forest, her white-tipped tail the last glimpse before she vanished completely into her new home. The community center buzzed with energy as residents filed in for the wildlife coexistence meeting. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating faces that just weeks ago had been creased with worry and suspicion. Now those same faces held expressions of interest and openness. Tom settled into his seat in the front row, nodding hello to familiar faces. The room quieted as Marianne stepped up to the podium, her presentation materials neatly arranged before her. Good evening, everyone, she began, her voice warm and confident. Tonight we're here to discuss practical steps toward living harmoniously with our wild neighbors. The projector hummed to life, displaying images of wildlife-friendly fencing designs. Marianne explained how these barriers could protect property while allowing safe passage for animals. She moved through her slides, outlining plans for educational workshops and designated feeding zones well away from homes. As she spoke, heads nodded in agreement. The atmosphere felt lighter, more hopeful than previous meeting. Tom noticed several people taking notes, their pens moving quickly across paper. When Marianne called for volunteers for the Wildlife Coexistence Committee, hands shot up around the room. Mrs. Peterson, the librarian, offered to host educational materials. Samuel, the handyman, volunteered his expertise for fence modifications. Then Mr. Grady stood up, clearing his throat. Tom turned surprised to see his once skeptical neighbor addressing the room. I'll admit I was wrong about all this, Mr. Grady said, his weathered face earnest. Watching how things unfolded with Grace's situation taught me something important. We can do better by our wildlife neighbors. The room broke into spontaneous applause, and Tom felt a warmth spread through his chest. Over the next hour, plans took shape. New signs would be installed around the conservation area, providing guidance for hikers and wildlife observers. Marianne announced her partnership with the elementary school, scheduling regular field trips to the sanctuary. Throughout the discussion, people occasionally glanced at Tom, some asking him to share bits of Grace's story. He spoke quietly but clearly, describing how one small fox had changed not just his life but the entire community's perspective. When the meeting concluded, Tom walked home through the familiar streets where once he had hurried along, avoiding eye contact. Now he exchanged waves with neighbors tending their gardens. Mrs. Davis called out to ask when the next wildlife workshop would be held. Even teenagers on their bikes slowed to greet him, one asking about the new signs he'd helped install at the conservation area. The town felt different now, more connected, more aware. The change wasn't just in the new signs or modified fences, but in the way people moved through their days with greater awareness and appreciation for the wild creatures sharing their space. The morning air held a gentle crispness as Tom settled into his favorite porch chair, wrapping his hands around a steaming cup of coffee. Golden sunlight filtered through the trees, casting dappled shadows across his weathered deck. His gaze drifted over the familiar yard where Grace's enclosure had once stood. The quiet morning invited reflection, and Tom's mind wandered back to that stormy night months ago. He could still picture Grace clearly, a tiny, mud-covered bundle shivering in his headlights. The memory was so vivid, her terrified eyes meeting his, the way she trembled in his hands as he lifted her From the ditch, a smile tugged at his lips as he remembered her transformation from that frightened kit into a playful, curious creature she would pounce on rolled up. Socks, her white tipped tail twitching with excitement. Sometimes she would look up at him with those bright eyes, and he'd feel the walls around his heart crumbling just a little. More, the bittersweet memory of their final goodbye at the sanctuary rose in his mind. Grace had paused at the edge of the forest, glancing back one last time before disappearing into her true home. That moment had been both an ending and a beginning. The changes in town were subtle but unmistakable. Just yesterday, Mrs. Peterson had stopped him outside the grocery store to share her excitement about spotting a fox family near the conservation area. Children on their way to school would point out the new wildlife information signs with pride, having learned about local animals during their sanctuary visits. At the shelter, where Tom continued his counseling work, he found himself drawing on his experience with Grace. When talking with people who felt lost or afraid, he understood better than ever how small acts of kindness could transform lives. He shared Grace's story with those who needed hope, showing how trust and patience could build bridges between the most unlikely companions. The morning sun climbed higher, warming Tom's face as he sat quietly with his memories. A profound sense of peace settled over him, knowing that by saving Grace, he had found his own salvation. The frightened, guilt-ridden man who once struggled to connect with others had found purpose and community. Through caring for a small wild creature, Tom whispered a prayer of thanks, his voice barely audible above the morning bird song. Grace had taught him about second chances, not just for herself, but for everyone. She had shown him how to open his heart again, to stand up for what he believed in, and to trust in the power of compassion to change minds and heal wounds. Rising from his chair, Tom felt the familiar sense of gratitude and purpose that now colored his days. He stepped off the porch into the bright morning light, ready to embrace whatever the day might bring. If you enjoyed the story of Tom, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.